to the program. I just want to ask a general question to begin with. You all were there. I know you were, doing your stint in government as a minister. Now you're president during the first Trump term. Do you remember what it was like? I mean, people called him the chaos agent. There was sort of a sense of a collective nervous breakdown happening for 4 years around the world.
Well, I think there was probably at that time, there was more a sense of surprise because a lot of people thought, including the pollsters, that Hillary Clinton would win the election. And I think Europe was then trying to come to terms with the new president called Donald Trump. But now this time around, everyone knows what Donald Trump stands for. I think on foreign policy has been very clear. So in many ways, you could say that a lot of European leaders are much better prepared and probably therefore much more willing and able to cooperate.
I know that you've got to work with the next president. I'm not asking you to diss one and praise another one, but I asked Jeff Zelny, our correspondent, about Biden's legacy. In foreign policy, particularly European policy, NATO policy, what would you say his strengths and legacy would be?
Well, I think the starting point for a small country like Finland is that both Joe Biden as president and at the time President Donald Trump supported Finnish NATO membership, and that meant a lot to us. I think there was a lot to grapple during this 4-year period, and it all started, of course, on the 24th of February 2022 when Russia attacked Ukraine. So in that sense, I think American foreign policy has been quite steadfast. And I would argue, especially in the beginning of the war, that it was very much a cross-party line that was coming from the U.S.
So let me just ask you from your perspective, since you are a new NATO member and public opinion shifted in your country to allow you to join because of the Russian invasion of full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There is a huge debate in Washington as to what President Trump will do to resolve or to continue this, certainly American help, for Ukraine. What do you think? What do you expect? And can you pick up any slack?
Well, I think the starting point is to say that we need to work together with Ukraine. And you also have to, I think, take President Trump at face value. When he says something, he does it. And of course, he's talked a lot about getting peace done both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And I think the window of opportunity that we have right now is from when the election result came to probably Inauguration Day. And then we'll see what happens. My starting point is that Zelensky will probably need 4 things. 1 is territory. 2 is security and security guarantees. Number 3 is justice, so Russian war criminals indicted. And then number 4 is reconstruction. And I'm sure that President Donald Trump-elect and his administration are already working with the Ukrainians on that. And from what I understand, President Trump and President Zelensky had a phone call already yesterday.
They certainly did, and Trump has said, I can fix this war in 1 day, but he's never said who he wants to win.
Yeah, I think the starting point here is that, from my perspective, at least because the war is existential, that politically you could say that Ukraine has already won, because you have to look at what was the aim of President Putin. It was to Russify Ukraine, it was to split Europe, split NATO, and make sure that NATO doesn't enlarge. Well, what did he get? He got a European or Euro-Atlantic Ukraine, he got a unified European Union, he got a unified transatlantic partnership, he got a rejuvenated NATO, and the icing on the cake, of course, is that Finland now doubled NATO's border with Russia. So in that sense, I would argue that politically Ukraine has already won.
Can I talk to you more about more general European, imperatives here? So you talked about unity. We've been reading and listening to some of the analysis since this election. It's potentially some countries are going to sort of build on their individual relationships with Donald Trump and, flocking to Mar-a-Lago. Let me just read what Gerard Araud, the former ambassador to the U.S. for France, said. Expect Europeans to flock to Mar-a-Lago in droves to demand preferential treatment over their neighbors. Are you concerned that this could be a divide and conquer moment?
Well, not really, but I do have to admit that foreign policy in today's world is probably a little bit more transactional than what it used to be. And you have to remember that U.S. foreign policy, whether with Trump or with Biden, has been very much focused on forging alliances. And those alliances have either been bilateral or trilateral, as was the case with Quad, where you have Japan and India, or AUKUS, where you have the United Kingdom, Australia, together with the U.S. And then, of course, they're regional, as they are with NATO. And within that, you have those guys who take care of their own defense, like Finland. They will, of course, have a very close relationship with the United States, whether with the Biden administration or the Trump administration. So the United States has put for a long time already their interests at first. And that means that some bilateral relations are probably going to be deeper than others. Finland, for instance, a security provider, long border with Russia. We have a DCA agreement with the United States, Defense Cooperation Agreement. We're a country that you can trust, and of course it's in our interest to have very close relations with the United States, which is a very close ally to ours.
And what about the notion of Trump proofing? And this is what I mean by this is if Trump decides to change the terms of NATO protection and all the things that he said before. We've heard President Macron, who was in Budapest, as you know, there was a big meeting today of European leaders. Zelensky was there as well. He has said Europe must stop outsourcing its security and write its own destiny. There's an idea that, banding together with Germany, the two big powers in Europe, but both are very, very, very grievously wounded. Macron kind of shot himself in the foot with that election that he basically lost. He's got a massive budget hole. Schulz's coalition has fallen apart. Where do you think Europe stands in terms of being self-sufficient?
Well, 2 points on this. First, Europe needs the United States, and the United States needs Europe, because the US wants to be a superpower, and in order for it to be able to compete with China, it needs allies. Those closest allies come from Europe. There are about 40 of us who have both the same values and interests that the United States have. Now, one thing that I tell my European colleagues is it's time to start taking care of our own security a little bit more. And what we will see with the new Trump administration, I think correctly so, he's going to force, or at least persuade, European states to increase their defense budgets. And remember that in 2014, there were only 3 countries in NATO that hit that 2% margin. Now there are 23, so the movement is already there, but I would argue that we're probably going to have to increase our defense expenditure, and then the way in which it happens is a different story. I think we do it for 2 reasons. 1, because the United States wants it, and 2, because it's in our self-interest in the current security political situation.
I just want to play this soundbite because I know it's kind of repeating what you just said, but this is also the view of the new NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte.
When he was president, he was the one in NATO who stimulated us to move over the 2%. And now, also thanks to him, NATO, if you take out the numbers of the US for a moment, is above the 2%. And I think very much that is his doing, his success, and we need to do more. We know this.
So I just wanted to put that out there, which you commented on. But, you talked about alliances. Trump is notoriously skeptical of alliances. And it was considered when Biden became president that he did a lot to restore the strength of the transatlantic alliance. So on one issue, if Donald Trump decides that America will no longer pay that amount to Ukraine, deliver that amount of weapons to Ukraine, does Europe have the wherewithal to fill the necessary gap?
Well, Europe has already filled the necessary gap. I think there's this narrative that the US has done more than Europe. That's not the case. It's about 50-50. If you then start looking at, say, GDP per capita, Finland is the fifth biggest donor. If you, of course, look at raw donations, then it comes from the US. And I do think that Europe needs to take more responsibility. But this is probably one of the incentives also to start ending the war or trying to find some kind of a peace settlement. I think the money funnels at the end of the day are going to be a little bit more in a win-win situation because, of course, when the war is over, it's going to be all about reconstruction. And suddenly we're going to start seeing a lot of companies, European, American, and others, who want to come and do the reconstruction of Ukraine. But I do think that Europeans understand that we have to take more responsibility, but we will survive, and we will survive together with the United States.
So on the other issue, you were once, I believe, finance minister, and as you know, President Trump has literally said he loves tariffs. Tariffs is the best word in the dictionary, and he's going to slap some 20% tariffs on just about every country. Now, we'll see whether he picks and chooses and what he does, but he's done it before. This is what an expert told the New York Times. A Trump victory is very painful for Europeans as it confronts them with a question that they've tried to hide from. How do we deal with the United States that sees us more as a competitor and a nuisance than a friend to work with? Do you agree with that assessment? And what do you see as the result of a massive tariff regime?
Well, I think here's where I put my former trade minister hat on, which is probably even more relevant than the finance minister hat in this particular case. I belong, of course, to the category of free traders. So I believe that free trade actually improves and gives economic growth and stealth and development. Now, I think we have to pick and choose here a little bit. There will be probably tariffs put up by the United States in some areas. Some of them will go to Europe, some of them will go elsewhere. But I think the key here is to try to build confidence so that Europe and the United States can have as much free trading as possible. Because if, of course, the competitor is China, then the US needs to consider in which directions the tariffs go. There are countries, say, like Finland, who have a lot to give on, for instance, mobile networks. Nokia is a good example. Or on quant technology and quant computers. So there's a lot of work that we can do with the United States, but of course we'll have to see how things settle, what kind of tariffs might come into play. There's one little sort of reminder. Europe does have exclusive competence, so the EU decides on trade, on customs, on monetary policy, and on competition. So there it is really Brussels that decides and has the discussion with the United States.
So the analysis is that Donald Trump has essentially identified trade and immigration, migration, whatever you want to call it, as the big issues of his time, of everybody's time, and that he has absolutely pushed this issue far to the right. We've just talked about tariffs and protectionism, and we know what he wants to do with immigration, mass deportation. And the thing is, that is the case all over Europe right now. I mean, even more liberal governments, if you want to say that, are taking much, much more tough and more right-wing policies on migration. Would you say that Trump and people like Giorgia Meloni and Orban and Marine Le Pen and all those people have pushed Europe much further to a nationalist right?
Oh, definitely. I think the mega trend that we have right now is to the right. So if there was a pendulum, say, at the end of the Cold War, it was all about market, 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 freedom, 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 and including free movement and immigration. Now that trend has swung over to the other side, and I think it already started sometime during the financial crisis, because that's when a lot of people felt not comfortable with, say, the capitalist financial system that we have. It hit mortgages, it hit jobs, it hit growth, and suddenly people felt quite sort of disoriented and thought, hey, listen, globalization was supposed to be a good thing to us, and especially to me, and then suddenly you're in a situation where it didn't. And of course, Brexit was a manifestation of that as well, because it was very much a rejection of the other. It was a rejection of free trade, it was a rejection of immigration. So that's the mega trend that we have right now in 2024. But I would argue that it's been going on for the better part of at least 15 years.
And do you think it'll continue, or do you think there's a swing back to be had?
Oh, there's always a swing back at some stage. But I think, in the world order in general, right now there is this rejection of multilateralism, of rules, of free trade, of institutions, of the WTO, of the UN. And what we need to understand is that we live now not in a bipolar, not in a unipolar, but a multipolar world. And with this multipolarity comes chaos. In order to contain that chaos, we need multilateralism. We need rules, but someone needs to start setting them. I'm just afraid it's going to take about 5 to 10 years before things start to settle, with or without Donald Trump. But he's going to be such a key player in this.
All right. Well, that's really an interesting point to close with. President Stubb, thank you so much for joining us from Helsinki.